All right, welcome, family. Welcome to the Mutant Ninja Politics Show. This is a special. We're calling it the Pregame Show to Trump versus Putin. This is, I think, a lot of people is really sleeping on the significance of what this meeting is. I'm likening it to a Super Bowl, and when I say a Super Bowl, I mean the Super Bowl. Right now, we have the two world's largest nations in terms of nuclear stockpile meeting head to head. And like, make no mistake about this, it was not Putin who requested this meeting, gave Trump a call, and begged him for this meeting. It was our president, President Trump, who sent his buddy, Mr. Witkoff, over there to Russia, begging to have a meeting and come together. And for those that don't know, President Putin, I say the Honorable President Putin. I'll tell you more about that later. But this gentleman, they have an international arrest warrant for him through the International Criminal Court for the actions inside Ukraine. However, so does Netanyahu for a much more deserved, situation to where he too has arrest warrant, for his arrest. But when he came to the United States, he was not at all held accountable, and of course allowed to move around the country, freely without arrest. So Putin had no ambitions of trying to come to D.C. So he's not coming to the Trump White House to only to get kicked out and all that type of madness like we saw Zelensky do. Instead, the only way Trump was going to meet with the president, our President Trump, was if President Trump came to his doorstep. He was willing to step on U.S. soil, President Putin was, but he wanted President Trump as close to Russia as possible, hence Alaska, this Alaska meeting. And when I say the Super Bowl, not only the cameras that are allowed to be rolling are rolling, but the satellites, the birds up in space and geosync orbit, and not to mention, the other assets, that are gathering all type of recon around the area. You have the top military equipment from both sides positioned and ready to go, from submarines to the various airplanes and jets. The most sophisticated weaponry, including new weapon systems that weapon and the U.S. possess are all strategically placed right now and ready to rock and roll. For example, should anything happen, to Putin, he's already explained, what this whole dead hand was about. And, just to remind people, in terms of, what the dead hand is also known as the perimeter. This is a semi-automatic weapon system that was developed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But of course, Russia has upgraded this system and made it, a very, much more sophisticated. But this basically ensures a retaliatory nuclear strike, decapitation strike, if a decapitation strike is attempted on Russia first, with their leadership or their command structure. Okay. So again, this guarantees a counterstrike by Russia if Russia is hit by a nuclear attack, or even if its leadership is incapacitated or communication lines are destroyed. Automatically, bam, every nuclear weapon that the Russia has is launched towards, not only the United States, but, her allies as well. Okay. So this has already been put out there, inside the atmosphere. And so now Putin is literally coming with these individuals that we just got finished talking about, the country's leadership and command structure. He's coming with them over into U.S. territory in Alaska, with, again, all these assets are all around, for everybody, and so should anything happen to Putin, then now everyone is clear of what happens. So I feel like, and I like I said, I like Putin a lot. I think he is the best. If you want to look at leaders this century, I don't think you can find one who's better, period, than the Honorable President Putin. And you could call me whatever you want to. I'm just looking at history, Russia's history. I'm looking at the accomplishments, of Mr. President Putin, and I'm looking at that, through that lens, not through, the lens of, what the United States government says and Europe says, but I'm looking at it through the lens of actual facts and history. And in my assessment, I believe that President Putin is by far the best leader in this century, period. Having said that, I think that, most people are not expecting a lot to happen here, but the fact that, again, you have the U.S. president meeting with, the Russian president, it is significant, especially after Biden, whom we had literally no communication lines with for at least 3 years, of his occupation of the White House. Okay. So again, here we are, we're here at this meeting now. And so now, let's talk about, what's the best case scenario, that could come out of this agreement, at the end of the day, with these two world leaders meeting, right now, just for reminders, in case people don't know, Russia has already put out the conditions of a ceasefire. Okay. There's only two. Those conditions are real simple and real plain. Number one, Ukraine needs to withdraw and pull their lines back from this buffer zone that Russia has decided to establish in lieu of, this madness and mischief that Ukraine, allowed the U.S. to push them into. They said Russia's going to establish this boundary, and so they need Ukraine to push back, to beyond this boundary that Russia has established now, and decide that this is what it's going to be. That's one of the attributes, that need to be completed, if you will, or tasks, I should say, that need to be completed. The next task that needs to be completed, and it too is simple. It shouldn't be hard. We should have never even had this happen in the first place. But now that it has, we're going to reverse it back and just say, hey, look, put it back, put the cookie back in the jar, and then, everything will be okay. And that is that there will no longer at all be ever again any discussions of Ukraine joining NATO. Any discussion. There will be no expansion of Ukraine and NATO. And so I believe, just again, based on my study and listening to, people who I respect and know, has a track record and history of being right and exact, and even when they're wrong, if you will, it's not like they were, totally wrong. It's just that, when you analyze the situation, you don't have all the facts. You got to go with what you have at the time. But people who have shown, that they are not liars and deceivers and are straight shooters, and cause they see it. I have a whole repertoire of people who I've been studying and following, since, way back, in the 90s. So, and so these individuals, I'm able to, glean off a lot of the information that they're sharing, because they have far more assets and intel, than I do in these circles, especially when it comes to geopolitics and, various military operators and whatnot. These are professionals, many who are former military, leaders, who you would call patriots. These are people who I rely on. They have that type of track record, and so as I'm listening to a lot of intel, what most people, are saying and making it real clear is that without, these two, scenarios being agreed upon, there's really nothing to talk about. There's really nothing to talk about, because Russia has complete air dominance over Ukraine. They have complete drone superiority over Ukraine. Right now, the most deadliest individual you could be in the Ukrainian ranks, right now, the most deadliest individual is a drone operator, because the Russians have mastered the art of drone warfare now, to now not only drone warfare offensive, but counteroffensive, to where now, as soon as the Ukrainians fire up, the drones, then they're going to get hit shortly thereafter, because Russia's able to hone in on those signals and immediately hit them. Again, complete air superiority. And now, there is a region to where Russia has now opened up, even more dominance, to where it's a key supply line into Ukraine. So, but just by cutting this off, that means Ukraine can't use it, and now the Russians, have, this pathway, in, allows them to get behind and flank. From a military strategic standpoint, this is so significant and so major. I almost feel like, and I hope, Mr. Putin's not making a mistake. I almost feel like he's coming over and agreed to this to gloat. Honestly, because Russia they're completely 1,000% in the driver's seat. There's nothing that Trump could say or do at all, despite what Agent Zelensky, has to say, as well. There's nothing, these sanctions or whatnot are not harming Russia, as much as, they claim that they are. They're not. Russia's got stronger. They've gotten, they've gained economically, and not to mention the strategic alliances they now have, with China and Iran. They're even stronger than where they once were. So like I said, this is, Putin's in the driver's seat. He's in control. From a military perspective, I mean, we got to be honest. The Russian military is combat proven now. They've been, now look, when we talk about Ukraine and the fact that they're getting soundly defeated, I got to be plain, because unfortunately the American people are just simply being lied to. When I've been saying being lied to, starting with the casualties, right? So the casualties, on the Ukraine side versus the Russian side, there is a huge gap. A huge gap, and the discrepancy that the American people that you're getting from your media, when you start to learn more of these facts about just how wrong, that not only the media has been, telling you, but any other person, including the politicians, how wrong they've got it, on these numbers. But right now, by most people's in terms of the independent, people who are studying, a lot of different data points in terms of the ascertain, the dead on both sides. Now, granted, both governments, they don't publish that information. So it's taking a lot of effort, from different, individuals to come up with a formula that they share in terms of how they come up with these numbers. But the numbers that we're talking about is on the Russian side, in terms of casualties, there are less than 200,000 casualties on the Russian side. I say again, less than 200,000 casualties on the Russian side. However, when we look to the Ukrainian side, this is what is, so, I mean, to me, it's sad, even though, look, the history of Ukraine and who they idolize, Banderas, and these other various neo-Nazis, I'm not a fan of Ukraine, so, but even still, that's not going to get away over my analysis of the situation. And that analysis is that, again, looking at, the numbers that other people, who are breaking this down at a higher level than any of us, the estimates are less than 200,000 on the Russian side, and a staggering 1.8 million KIA on the Ukrainian side. My goodness. I mean, that is these numbers. First of all, again, the discrepancy from what even President Trump has told the American people, let alone what the media has been reporting and other leaders, within both parties, Republican and Democrats, have been telling you. They haven't been telling you numbers like that, but I could say, very confidently, in these numbers, I could present these numbers, and do so, like I said, very, very confidently, mainly because of, the research I put into it, but even more importantly than that, those who, I respect, and have come to know as being actual and factual, on a regular, repeated basis, they too, have agreed with these numbers as well. So they're not. It's not in debate that there is a lot more KIA Ukrainians than Russians. That's not even up for a debate. So again, the Russia, the worst case, of this whole meeting is going to be if this is allowed to continue, via, America, because it's the United States government that ultimately is allowing this to continue. Trump right now, he could literally, say that, especially, it will align with what he told us all before he was elected in terms of eliminating the deep state, not putting us in foreign wars, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What he can do is he could go ahead and just say, hey, we're going to change the United States position, in terms of our foreign policy, and we're going to go ahead and no longer, look and see Russia as this threat, and have them, in this bubble that we allowed them to be in. The president could change that whole dynamic, and then on top of that, let Zelensky know, that, and Europe know that, look, if you all want to go ahead and carry on, with this foolishness, then you can do so in your own accord, but leave the American people and our resources out of this, because this could only lead to a greater escalation, the potential of nuclear war, and for what, Ukraine? And for what, Ukraine? You see what I'm saying? That's what Trump should do. That's what my expectations, was in terms of, based on what his rhetoric was, leading up into the election, was that it would be that, but it has not been that. Everything he's done has been Trump, the exact opposite, but, again, this, right now, I think that essentially Putin's going to come here, or come here to Alaska. They're going to have this meeting, and there's not going to be much really, to discuss. Either the United States is going to change its course and change its position, or not. What I mean? And then so, like I said, this I feel like is a gloating session, because if they don't know, or act like they don't know, then the very capable delegation, a Russian delegation, is going to be able to let the opposition know exactly what's going on. So right now, I know that I wasn't expecting to have any live, very many, people watching live. And this is just something I really want to do with, some, just to come and just chop it up with some friends and family, essentially about, what I'm seeing, because essentially, and hopefully, I have a brother joining us later on. But what I'm hoping is that ultimately from this whole discussion is, I'm going to lay out some facts again about, expectations, but, as I have given a little background, as well as what's going on, but ultimately what everything I say, what is going to lead to the exciting conclusion is that you all should get prepared. And when I say prepared, I mean prepared to get out the way, because the way this thing is looking, is that, right now, things seem to be ramping up, and it almost feels like, I can tell you right now. So when you look at towards the end of Mr. President Biden's, so-called presidency, towards the end of that, we now know that Biden had already checked out. The auto pen was being utilized to this day. We still don't know exactly who, but the auto pen is being utilized, and we had a bunch of unelected individuals making decisions, and bad ones, mind you, to where they literally had us, according to what some say, or were various reports by various government agencies here in the U.S., that they were predicting that, just looking at the reality of the fact that there was like a 50 to 60% chance of a nuclear war occurring before President Trump even got sworn in. That's where it looked like this thing was going, based on the actions and whatnot that the outgoing administration was going. And of course, these was action that, the American people did not want. Hence why, I won't call it a landslide, but a decisive victory for Trump. This is why the people leaned that way, at the end of the day, and so, here we are today, right back in the saddle. And when I say right back in the saddle, I mean right back in the saddle in terms of, we probably have at least another 50 to 60% chance of there being a potential nuclear war. Like I said, just right now with these guys meeting, and coming together, what if some somehow, some way, some dummy, within the U.S. government concocted some dumbass plan, to where essentially, Putin and the delegation are going to be detained. Then that right there, so thus far, there have been many red lines. I got to say this, there have been many red lines that the United States and Europe has crossed Russia's, to where Russia had to reestablish and reaffirm what these red lines are and where they're at, and they publish, the nuclear protocol. Okay, they have that outline for the world to know. Now a whole doctrine. And so, because of that, that doctrine, if they have been known to show leniency, mainly because it's like the Russians, believe it or not, I know your media is telling you something different, but they're the adults in the room. They're the adults in the room. They're the one trying to avoid greater actions and conflict. Even in this whole Ukraine thing, this whole thing was piping down, but what gave it more life, was the fact that ultimately Biden and the United States, a government had Nazis, come to our halls, and to our chambers, of the American people, and then pledge support and money to them, which then escalated this thing at 1.8 million KIA Ukrainians later. And I gotta add, because any life, a loss of life is tragic, and the fact that 200 brave Russian, men, have died in this effort. These 200,000. I'm sure that they had families, they had friends and loved ones as well as those 1.8 million Ukrainians. So just the loss of life here is just tragic. But this could have not happened, had the United States government under Biden gave these weapons. But now I'm also now on the same rhetoric in terms of that Mr. Trump, this is not Mr. Trump's war. It is. It's yours now, buddy. Because you said a day. And look, I knew that when he said a day, they mean literally a day, but he meant that, he could get this wrapped up real quick, And like I said, as I mentioned earlier, there are, positions that Trump could take that could absolutely, change the whole doctrine towards the United States or towards Russia, and have Russia have us diplomatically on a whole different path with Russia. To where it would be beneficial to not only the United States of America, but to the world, because the world doesn't need the potential of this conflict, breaking out, but for people that understand what this is really about, is that America and, the debt that she's accumulated, and the more debt that was added underneath this big, beautiful bill, that she's just in a position to where it is seemingly impossible to get out. Now, Trump floated some ideas around, but right now, everyone knows that not only is this currency backed by nothing but military might, there's no gold, there's no, it's being printed out of thin air, so the people know that. But in addition, what they know is that if you take the money and you rely on the money, you depend on the money, that, for, any reason, if you don't bow down to the whims of the government, who our government is, I hate to say it, unfortunately, is run by neocons, warmongers, and Zionists. If you don't bend to their will, then they'll weaponize that currency and then harm you and your people, and then have your people turn on you, as if you're the enemy, and try to destroy you. These is a cold-blooded people, that we're talking about, at the end of the day, and they're wickedly wise, and I don't think a lot of people really, appreciate that, but, again, where we're at, right now is exactly, again, the Super Bowl, but we're also in a position to where annihilation is a strong possibility. So when I say get out the way, people are really going to have to look at, okay, in the case of, a nuclear exchange, it's like you really have to be already out the way before it even happens. So it's like you have to study, what's going on in the world geopolitically, and you have to get the facts. So already you're at a major disadvantage if you're not, receiving accurate intel and accurate data. You're already, because, you will be doing maybe the right thing given the intel that you had, But if that intel is inaccurate, then you're doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. And that can have devastating, consequences. But, the weapon systems that now America and already the Russians, have, this like, for example, this Oreshnik, this Oreshnik is not intercontinental. There's another one, that the Russians have upgraded and use now. That my understanding was that they were looking to do a nuclear test, today on the eve of this meeting with the United States. So I will here in a moment, confirm if that did, take place, but, the Russians are absolutely coming with some devastating, weapon systems. But again, getting out of the way is, you have to be already out the way. That's the key, because these missiles are hypersonic and they don't take a long time to strike. And then being that, here we're in California, we're going to get hit first, because we're closer, so it's that simple, so you don't have a lot of time, so you have to be out of the way in advance. So then where do you go? Where do you go? And so, I think, a big part of your methodology is, you have to look at first the layout of the land in terms of the United States, and that if you're anywhere near a significant military base, then you're part of the target package. You're going to get hit with a nuke. Okay. If you're, a nuclear power plant or any type of nuclear infrastructure, you're going to get hit. Okay. The major cities, here in the United States, the major populous cities, and they have various key infrastructure, they're going to get hit. And then, for those that are out there, oh man, they can't hit, everybody, well, what you mean they can't hit everybody? I mean, first, I think you got to have an understanding of, well, what does, the U.S., and Russia have, at the end of the day, what is the equipment, the personnel, right now, what we're talking about in particular is we're talking about, the the nuclear, forces that they have. So just now in terms of aircraft, the U.S. dominates. In terms of aircraft. 13,000 aircraft. 1,900 fighters to Russia's 800, and then America has some great fighters, but again, that's not what we're talking about. We have the submarines, aircraft carriers, 11 aircraft carriers, 68 submarines, right? 90 destroyers and cruisers for the U.S. side. When you compare that to Russia's Navy, only one aircraft carrier is aging, 60 submarines, 15 destroyers. But look, all this equipment I'm naming, that's all warfare. That's not new warfare. A new warfare is a hot warfare, in particular. And so the key thing that we have to look at is the nuclear arsenal. Now, this is where there is an advantage to Russia. By 2023 estimates, and, from what most people are saying, the U.S. has 5,200 warheads. And this is with the advanced delivery systems like the Minutemen, 3, ICBMs, the Tridents, we're talking about, those situations. So 5,200 warheads. Russia has 5,900 warheads, the largest stockpile with modernized ICBMs, including being on hypersonic weapons and, as well as, their various other, equipment. Now, again, from a submarine standpoint, which is used to launch nuclear weapons, this is where things are really close in terms of the naval force. The U.S. has 68 submarines, and we don't know, but the Russians have approximately around the same thing. The estimates I'm looking at here, we're saying around 60. So slight advantage to the U.S. But again, Russia produces a lot of their own situations and doesn't rely. They have reliable partners in terms of supplying them, for a lot of their needs militarily, including to make these various vessels, and unfortunately, for the United States is, they rely on people they declare to be enemies, for much of their equipment. And so now said enemy, i.e. China, has already begun to reduce, that stockpile, and it's funny because now, I'm not known for, dropping, a scripture on people and whatnot. That's usually my brother, but then, there is one that just come to mind. There is one coming to mind. If my brother Afro is listening right now, he gonna act like he got holy water spilled on him. You know what I'm saying? And a cross is in front of him. Like he a damn vampire. You know what I mean? But this is significant because again, for those that understand the reality of the situation is, again, America's economy and her dollar is on its way out. The global South is rising. They're developing, and that's ultimately what you're seeing right now. You're seeing, like nobody, everyone's getting tired of playing with the United States, so they're all breaking away, leaving, her, more alone and desolate. And so she getting mad, that people that have been, messing with her for years, is leaving. And so then she reaching out, causing a ruckus and causing mischief, trying to get them back and trying to bully them and be like, if you don't mess with me, then I'm going to cut off, everybody else, just ridiculousness, like, it's whack stuff, like, not manly, not, something that is in a position of like I would want to be seen in, so this scripture, that I'm about to mention, Revelations 18, 9 through 11, this is going to be the New International Version, and it says, when the kings of the earth who commit adultery with her and share her luxury and see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. That's the first part. Well, who are we talking about? Well, this scripture is talking about the mystery Babylon, right? The mystery Babylon. And, the mystery Babylon is just not a mystery anymore. We know who the mystery Babylon is. It is the United States of America. All right. And so, as the people who were, fornicating with her, sharing in her luxury, and participating in her sins, that her wickedness across the world, they're going to start seeing, her fall. And this is in scripture is represented by the smoke of her burning. All right. The smoke of her burning means that, now she's starting to fall, and so now those that were, once messing with her, they're beginning to weep and mourn because look, not only was they having a great time, with this whore, but, they were making money. They were making money. Everybody was winning. They was making money now to others' demise. But the wicked, they were having the times of their life. So now they're going to weep, and mourn over her. But now notice it's not saying that they hanging out with her. You know what I'm saying? They're looking from afar. So terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, "Woe! Woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour, your doom has come." So like I was saying, so now they saw smoke, she's on fire and whatnot, but, all these cats that used to, mess with her, that they're out in the cuts, they're away and they're like, look, man, I'm just gonna remember the good old days, wish they didn't end, they're gonna watch her burn, but then at the same time, they're terrified of her torment, because they're starting to think now, wait a minute, Babylon has fallen. This was the great Babylon has fallen, and then, we were, comrades that were kind of like Epstein, right? All these cats that was kicked with Epstein, Epstein, he's not even the top of the ladder, right? The pyramid, but everyone hanging with him and whatnot, Kings with him, he go down, everybody, they far off. Oh man, I didn't know I kicked the window a time or two, but it was never no young girls around, they were far off, what I'm saying? But they worry because they're like, damn, am I on the list? Am I on the list? Am I going to get caught up in a snare or something? Well, Trump and the team, they made sure that that's not going to happen. All right. They didn't shut it down, for now. My brother Yusuf might come on. He might say something different, but, for now, he didn't shut it down. But the merchants of the earth, right? So these are, again, those making money, these is your Amazons, your all these, your PayPals, all these guys, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. No one buys their cargo anymore. What does that mean? What that means is that, again, nobody wants to mess with this whore anymore because now she burning. She done caught something. She burning. Who want to mess with a whore that they can contracted some sort of, a disease. A disease that got her burning. So, and then on top of that, we talking about literally burning. On fire, hair on fire, burning up like the damn, wicked. By the way, on a side note, I hadn't seen it till just recently. I checked the Wicked out, and I see now what the hoopla was about. I like what they did. I thought it was funny as hell. I like what they did with it. Shout out to Wicked. But going back to this whole U.S. military situation again. We're talking about the nuclear warheads. Almost over 6,000 warheads is what Russia have. That's enough to hit a lot of different places. A lot of different places. For example, right now, let me check something out here. Let me check this out here right now. So just to put it in perspective, I was trying to see, okay, how many, what were the various incorporated cities and towns and villages as a whole inside the United States. They're saying approximately about 19,500, but now I want to say how many cities in the U.S. With let's say 500,000 people, 500,000 people or more. I don't know why my numbers wasn't working. Here we go. 500,000 people. I want to see what that looked like. So there are 27 incorporated U.S. cities with populations between 500,000 and 1 million. Wow, that's not very many. So 500,000. Let me put. In fact, I'm gonna lower that number now because now, that's way less than what I was thinking. But I guess it does make sense. But let me come over here. Let's just say 200,000. Let's say 200,000 plus population. Let's see what that is right there. And so this one right here, they're gonna give me the whole list. I just wanted a ballpark, baby, just a little ballpark. Right there. Yeah, they gave me a list of them. So it's not many. It's not many, guys. It's not many. I'm looking at. Just looking at the list, so at the highest, we're looking at New York City, 8 million, LA, damn near 4 million, Chicago, damn near 3, Houston, 2, Phoenix, 1.6, Pennsylvania, 1.5, San Antonio, 1.5, San Diego, 1.4, Dallas, 1.3, and then when we come down lower on the list, just some honorable mentions over here, Nashville, 700,000, Denver, 729, Frisco, 800,000, Fresno, 550,000, Sacramento, 532,000, Spokane, Washington, 229, Little Rock, 200,000. So you're talking about that's not a big list. That's less than 100 cities. So again, 6,000 warheads. And there's plenty to cause some havoc. And why would we want to even allow this to even be a possibility? I have a homie, and I study him. He's at UC Davis, and I used to watch how he would move. And with me, when I was younger, I got real defiant and reckless as I began to come awake and learn, if you will, that there was more than meets the eye, and so when this took place, then for the way my behavior is manifesting themselves, coming to this reality was just outright defiance, acting a fool, like donuts in the freeway, police chases, getting away, just reckless type of stuff. But my folks, I'm not even mentioning names, man, my folks, he know who he is. He had a whole different approach. And then what I ended up summing up his approach, what I summed it up to be was if you don't want it to be an option, then don't let it be an option. It was just that simple. If it's not an option, don't let it be an option. And for him, that would mean where, if he didn't want to get caught up, with some damn marijuana, not only is he not going to have marijuana on him, but he's not going to even have any paraphernalia anywhere near him. And now he would go have some papers around because the papers are neutral. And then since he smokes cigarette, he could say he rolling some cigarettes. You see what I'm saying? So he was just real strategic in how he moved, and it kept him out of trouble. He went on to have not only a wonderful, prosperous career working with, one of the top, U.S. companies, but, went on to establish a beautiful family. absolutely beautiful family. You see what I'm saying? So it's not an option. Don't let it be an option right now. What, Trump, and these neocons and these Zionists and these warmongers, what they're allowing, they're allowing nuclear option to be an option right now. That's not what you want to do. You don't want to let it be an option. So how can you not let it be an option? Then, we can be engaging in Russia respectfully. That's all this is. At the end of the day, this conflict started because you had these warmongers and the people I just mentioned over here saying, look, we need to continue to expand west, forget what Russia is talking about. We're not worried about what they're talking about. We just need to go ahead and do what we want to do. You see what I'm saying? And so that right there is not and was not the proper approach. Something completely different, should have been done, and, it would have been, the wage piece wouldn't have been, real difficult, and I want to throw out, throw a shout out, to, Scott Ritter in particular, man. Like, if you guys don't know who he is, man, just look him up, a very knowledgeable, individual. And, he's participated in a lot of, efforts, in particular on peace efforts, and to not allow this nuclear option to be an option. And one of the projects he's involved with, a project, I think it's called Project 38, and it was is dealing with the necessity of arms control, and it's basically saying that, look, when these weapons are launched, you don't have long, for them to hit and cause this catastrophic destruction. So he asked, and this project asked for people to think about, in that moment, put yourself in that moment where nuclear weapons are hitting, in a moment just before it hits, think about what you would have done different and could have done different prior to the moment that you find yourself in, which is nuclear weapons hitting, destroying you, your family, and the earth. What are some, activities and efforts, no matter how minimum they could have been, what could you have done to, change potentially the outcome that you find yourself in and we find ourselves in that moment, and then as you put yourself there, you're asked to now take that energy and then go ahead and deploy it right now, because that's where we're at, folks. That's where we're at, and that is, again, why I'm calling this the Super Bowl, because there is so much at stake here. And then I set the stage earlier, the stage is amazing. Right now, every nuclear weapon, is pointed, to our country right now as Putin and team is about to descend, over here in Alaska. You know what I mean? And, it's, I mean, man, people really appreciated, the reality of the situation, and just, thinking that, oh, everything's going to be okay. That, look, everything's not going to be okay. The United States, like, if they got into a conflict right now, just based on, there's been reports that's been made public now that has basically exposed, the U.S. and NATO vulnerabilities. There is a depleted U.S. missile stockpile. So much has been given to Israel, Ukraine, and others, and then the fact that then is not being mass produced, and we don't have those capabilities, here, and then the fact that we're using these defense contractors who do not love America at all. They do not. They'll act patriotic. They do great commercials. They do not love America at all. The only thing they love is that bottom line and that money. And a way you could determine that is that the equipment they make, when they make it to where there's proprietary components, to where you have to have, these contractors come out and actually do and repair the situations and do the work on the situations, to where that's an extraordinary expense, to the American taxpayer. So when you look at our military, the main reason why it's so expensive, is because all these inefficiencies has made us weak and vulnerable, so the fact that we have a president that's out here fronting and flossing, when, look, buddy, the whole world already knows that, the America is not once where she was. Now, granted, she has a nuclear stockpile, but again, the America has, at best, they say 8 days of missiles to be able to fight in conflicts around the world. So they start giving them away, and firing them. We simply don't produce enough, of these missiles. Especially, a big focus of these missiles has been, now these so-called missile shields, and iron domes that are not, doing much at all against these hypersonic weapons now. These things, these are, again, extreme vulnerabilities. 8 days. After 8 days, what do you do? After 8 days, what do you do? Surrender? No, the only thing that's left is the nuclear stockpile. So that's what I'm saying. Like, any type of conflict right now, if they start off right now, again, I remind people with Iran, I know you don't want to hear, I know you don't want to hear, when I say you, I'm talking about the masses of the American people. But look, there was Trump. He is promoting this bravado when really he's running around with no clothes on, and the whole world sees it. So when he's going over here and he's, acting like he did all this, to Iran, and he has Iran in check, the reality of it is that Israel and the U.S. was like, damn, Iran's, man, they hitting us hard. Way harder than what we could sustain, and the amount of money we're spending, by shooting down all these cheap drones and old stockpile of missiles they're sending over, is causing us an amazing amount of money. We need a pause in this situation. So Trump essentially, on Israel's behalf, came to Iran, made some type of little deal, where Trump could still show that he has a little muscle. And so he comes and drops bombs on already destroyed, supposedly, bunkers and whatnot, these nuclear, bunkers, where Iran is, have their weapons programs at, so they say, and whatnot. They hit those two, areas again, or maybe three. They hit these areas, but they had already been hit, and so there is no casualties. They already been hit, so okay, maybe you did a little bit more damage. But they've already been hit by Israel. What weapons you gave them, maybe you came in to do something on top of it. But again, it was largely symbolic, as was the fact that Iran calls up the U.S. and hey, here they come. We're going to send a couple missiles over there on this trajectory. Here's the coordinates. Go ahead and shoot them down. So they throw it over there, they shoot them down. And then now Trump comes back and says, okay, the missile program is done. It's finished. And this is what he's selling to the American people. But everyone knows that. No, it's not finished. It's not done. Iran is a big place, a very big place. They have, 100 million people there. It's way larger than, Israel. Again, a large landmass. There are areas that Iran has to where not only the weapon program has survived, but on top of that, they have to be encouraged now to pursue a nuclear weapon. They have to, because at this stage of the game, you're negotiating with America and Israel, and then Israel uses Trump, and Trump allows himself to be used as cover so that during negotiation, you attack the people that you're negotiating with. Like, I mean, this is only barbarians are known to do things like that. Those who aren't civilized, are known to behave in such a manner. But this is how our government, the U.S. government, along with Israel, decided to behave. And so if you're Iran now, I think you have no choice but to fully enrich and then, load some, of these weapons, into warheads, and then, do an underground test so that now the world knows that you have gone nuclear, and then now you're going to have to get dealt with, a little bit different. You know what I mean? You're going to be dealt with a little bit different. I think that's ultimately, what, again, these actions have done, by this, and I'm telling you, like, I'm pretty harsh on this administration. I did not vote for them, but I most assuredly did not vote for Ms. Harris, at all, or these Democrats at all. I instead voted for third party Dr. Shiva. If anyone has a plan, I like his plan the best. Honestly, but in general, as we wrap it up here, we're coming up on an hour. Just to kind of sum things up. Is again, I'm not really big, on much happening from this meeting. Russia, they're in the driver's seat, they're in control, and there is just not much. They're talking about right now. Trump is going to offer them some natural resources. Man, look, Ukraine, Russia already has natural resources, and now they have access again, to the sea, completely. Ukraine no longer, is in that area anymore. You're dealing with that Black Sea, so they, Russia is okay. They're okay. They don't need, any, minerals from the U.S. The U.S. needs their own minerals, right now more than anything. So how, he's over here giving stuff away, so I really hope Trump, really decides, to do what is in the best interest of the American people and indeed the world, and that is, to let Europe and Ukraine know that they want to continue this madness. They're going to go on it on their own and do so without United States support, at all, militarily, not using any of his assets, and that the United States government will now move to normalize relationships with Russia, and then and recognize the fact that we will not be expanding, NATO, beyond, West any longer, and that is what, I hope Trump does. I don't think that's what's going to happen, so I don't think there's going to be much movement, but I'm definitely going to be tuned in. Professor Jeffrey Sachs reminded people about the Monroe Doctrine. For those that don't know, this was, established by President James Monroe. And basically this is where, the United States was still weak at that time, but it basically said Europe, you stay in Europe, and, Americas will stay over here in the Americas, and people will abstain from involving in your conflicts and internal affairs, and the same thing here, and that's what we need right now. That's what we need the U.S. to go back to, is that particular philosophy, and then this whole thing would be piped down, so with that, I thank everyone for their time. In particular, I gotta throw a shout out, to the Focus Up team, the whole team. They, established this network and have been doing this now for, I want to say it's like 5 years now, going strong, and so just allow me the opportunity just to come on this platform and just share my thoughts. I appreciate the opportunity. And I won't be on the show for the next 3 weeks. I have a lot of family things going on, wrapping up this summer, but I enjoy the platform. I enjoy the people who chime in and interact with us on a regular. They're all great and wonderful. And maybe one day we'll have a more even expanded, audience, but again, these are just my thoughts here on this Russian conflict. I see my brother coming back on, but yeah, there he is right there. The producer, my brother Floyd X, as Mr. Nice would say, the boss. Brother, you got anything to say, man, to take us out of here, man, as we wrap up? Any questions you had, if you were listening to the show? I know you got a lot going on, but what's good with you? If you're there, you might be on mute right now because I can't hear you. But if not, and you don't have, there you go. I see you showing the mute is not on. I just can't hear you, my brother. So but we're coming up on that hour mark anyway. But again, man, just shout out to the whole Focus Up team, man. Y'all know who y'all are, man. All y'all, man. Afro, Nice, all the smooth criminals up out there. You know what I mean? All y'all. It's been wonderful, man, to be up on here with y'all, man. And don't forget, man, if y'all don't know, man, y'all gotta tune up to that Spin That Back show. It's gonna be back soon. There's always something hot, coming out for y'all. So definitely get a chance to check that out. And just don't forget, man, every Saturday, 9:00, the Focus Up show, man. The team is on. They come, they bring it. It's fun, informative, so enjoy. Thank you all for your time and have a great evening. Peace. Yeah.